So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our International Department Seminar. This academic year, we celebrate a decade of the seminar of the Department of Jewish Art and Ars Judaica Journal. As always, the 10th seminar brings together scholars from around the globe and offer a wide range of most innovative and remarkable research. Our first meeting this year find us here in Israel at hard times. Israel mourns the tragic loss of innocent people, continuously suffers from deadly attacks, and is united for its victory over evil. I thank all our friends, colleagues, and students who are present here and wish us a fruitful seminar and peaceful days to come soon. May our wounds be healed and our dear ones return safely to their homes. One final remarks, there might be interruptions to these Zoom meetings due to missile attacks. Whoever needs to go to the safe room, please do it and return safely to the session. And Maya, take it from here. Please introduce our guest.
I'm so honored to introduce Jessica. This is actually the second year we have tried to get her. And I'm, even in these circumstances, just so happy that she's joining us. Jessica Carr is Philip and Muriel Berman Scholar of Jewish Studies and an assistant professor of religious studies at Lafayette College in Eastern Pennsylvania. She's the author of The Hebrew Orient, Palestine in Jewish American Visual Culture, 1901 to 1938. Today, we're going to be hearing about her shift to graphic novels, which is how I found her actually, so I only found out about the book later. And to my mind, it's a natural shift as the medium is tied to both American visual culture and the Jewish experience abroad. Jessica.
Thank you so much. I really want to say thank you all for being here with me. I know it is just such a difficult time. I'm thinking of you all and your losses, and I'm feeling them with you as much as possible. So to that extent, I guess I hope I can offer you something else to think about as we turn to this project that I'm working on. Thank you all. Thank you to Tzvi for organizing. Thank you, Maya, for inviting me. And so I want to put on my slideshow so I can say a little something about then, oh gosh, this, sorry, hold on, the screen's not sharing. Okay, and then two things happened. It's not on the first slide. All right, we're almost there. Okay, now I think everything's up and running. Okay, so thank you so much. So I really appreciate this framing, actually, the continuity with the first book of thinking about the ways that this project is related to Jewish thought, in particular, that my area is in Jewish thought. I did my PhD at Indiana University in Jewish thought and culture. I didn't come out then of a department that was focused on art or visual culture in any way. I studied with Shaul Magid in particular, and I had the resources in general of a Jewish studies program, but really none of the people who I otherwise was working with were working on art or visual culture. But I saw it as a method, as an area that I wanted to work on because it made so many people in Jewish life visible. And I think I see it as a way of thinking about reconstructing Jewish life, and even this idea of the usable past as a way of thinking about memory, the relationship between memory and history. So this book, The Hebrew Orient, this comes from a phrase that's in a piece of, it's related to a piece of the Zionist Organization of America's visual culture, referring to the way that Jewish Americans described Palestine before there was a state of Israel, right? And so what I wanted to talk about was different ways that Jewish Americans from different ideologies imagined what was abroad, and the way that it became emotionally important to them, even when they had never gone, when they didn't intend to go, and what it had to do for them with being American. And a big part of what came out of this project for me was thinking that even though I thought a lot about gender and the ways that both images of Jews in the land of Israel, in the ways that people constructed really very Orientalist ideas at times, in some ways to respond to Christian Orientalism in the United States, which was really an aspect of white supremacy in the United States. In other ways, it to some extent made room for thinking about Jews, that there were these projects in the United States, for example, World's Fairs, which I talked about, that made room for Jews in the United States, and Jews kind of came to take up some of those images, but try to reclaim images of Jerusalem in particular and others. But coming out of that project, I felt like there was really a peculiar way that even for the women who I talked about in these chapters, there was not that much of a type of visualization of Jewish women's lives. And so that was how I came to a project that I worked on with Maya, that I was actually just reading Anya Linich's graphic novel, Lena Finkel's Magic Barrel, and I realized there's really something important happening here, that this is a type of reading I haven't done. And there's this incredible way that graphic novels are a space that Jews of any gender, and breaking down actually a possibility for thinking outside of a gender binary for those who want to, but men or women or non-binary people can represent themselves, but women in particular can represent their lives and think about a kind of fragmentation of the self. And that really drew me in. This image in particular, I think I can use some kind of tool to no, I can't get it to work. I was gonna try to point, but anyway, in this you can see that there's like oh no, go back please. No, not forward, back. That here you can see that there's really many different visualizations of
Jessica, sorry,
yeah.
I'm gonna interrupt you.
Sure.
You're not on slideshow, so I'm not sure. Are you still on the first? You're like on the regular presentation where you have the slides on the left.
Oh,
and you're
it's not,
frozen.
oh, it's
mouse
full
is
screen
frozen.
for me. Is it not full screen for you?
No, but your mouse is frozen. So I don't know if you want to.
Here, let me escape and go back in. Let me see if I do it from here.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
That's working?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I'm so sorry. Okay. So with this one, you can see that that there's these many different kind of fragmented selves on the page, right? That we have Lena who is a kind of fictionalization of Anu Linich. She calls it a semi-autobiographical text. And this really basically drew me in. This isn't the main text that I wanted to talk about, but I did want to kind of start by saying that this fragmentation of the self was one of the first things that I thought was so important about what graphic novels can represent, both as a way of talking about what the self is, something that is fragmented, but that the fragments can be held together without kind of being reduced to a whole that is somehow resolved, where all of the problems and edges go away, that rather these fragments and the many different versions of self are valuable and mean something. And yet this is the modern or the postmodern. I think there's something there that I'm working through that ties to what I want to talk about today. So the three texts that I really have to think about today are Ken Crimstein's The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt, A Tyranny of Truth, Ari Folman and David Polanski's Anne Frank's Diary, the graphic adaptation, and Lena Finck's Passing for Human, a graphic memoir. So each of the texts I'm discussing has a different type of authorship, all of which play with the importance of the relationship between truth, fiction, and memory, as well as memory and history. Liana Finck writes her own memoir and fictionalizes herself as Leora, so it works somewhat like Lena Finkel's Magic Barrel. Ari Folman and David Polanski adapt Anne Frank's writing about herself, I would argue, to engage her iconography and to restore her individuality. And Ken Crimstein stitches together the details of Hannah Arendt's life, political theory, and her friendships with many thinkers, especially Walter Benjamin, to present a graphic novel that feels almost like Hannah Arendt's memoir, but it contextualizes her life and her thinking from an embodied perspective. So Ken Crimstein's The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt embodies Arendt's own thinking that in a way that we must understand thought within context. The visual presentation of graphic text insists that we must consider Jewish thinkers' embodiment. From Hannah Arendt to Anne Frank to Liana Finck, from the Shoah to immigration to disability to intersectional feminism. These thinkers, I would say in particular Hannah Arendt and Liana Finck, several Jewish thinkers have been influenced by Isaac Denison's concept of blank space, an idea that even when history does not record the truth in ink, that memory does, that actually the real story doesn't take place in the ink of where history is written down, but in the blank space. So it comes from a short story from Isaac Denison that I'll talk about in detail. And I think this is really interesting with graphic novels, a form that always requires us to read using what is seen and unseen on the page, at the same time that we process what is said and unsaid, what is kind of allowed in writing, and in many other forms of writing on the page. At the same time, I'm going to talk about some ways that all writing is visual, and that we can consider in particular ways with graphic novels how this works that brings our attention to conventional novels as well as other political theory and Jewish thought and philosophy. So I'm going to look at how these graphic texts actually embody these writers' theories of storytelling, especially influenced by Denison, to give meaning to an individual life and to create a public world of shared narratives. So graphic novels present us with epistemological questions to bring to bear on the documents of history, not only on graphic text. So graphic novels offer, I would argue, a type of visual midrash to use as an exegetical tool to remind us of the layers of mediation between us and history, or us and the past, and the importance and usefulness of blank space in all visual and verbal narrative, and not to be distracted by the appearance of unmediated documents, as well as of letting others narrate our stories. Near the end of Liana Finck's graphic memoir, Passing for Human, during a chapter that follows the history of Leola's, and Leola is, again, Finck's pseudonym or kind of alternative self in the memoir, Leola's shadow is wandering around with Leola's mother's shadow. Finck illustrates a conversation between the shadows. Unlike most of the text, the pages are black with white ink, a negative image of most of what we see. The shift subverts what we're used to seeing, especially throughout the graphic memoir. This ties into Finck's implicit and explicit visual and verbal arguments that most information and stories, the most important stories, take place in the shadows. That where darkness may often be perceived to be negative, it's here turned into a photo or a graphic negative. And Finck illustrates how the dark and the shadows that might sometimes be evil are actually revelatory. They're good. So Bess's shadow quotes Isaac Denison's short story, The Dreamers. Denison is actually a pseudonym of Karen Blixen, whose many affinities with Finck I want to keep talking about. So the quote says, of a coffee tree with a bent tap root, that tree will never thrive nor bear fruit, but it will flower more rightly than the others. On another page, the shadow interprets the line. A woman who lost her shadow is like that coffee tree. She will tell the most inspired stories, but the stories will all die before they can bear fruit. Finck plays with shadows in a way that evokes Plato's cave, but in a way connected to biblical interpretation as well as the reception of literary and visual art. She argues that there were no shadows in the Garden of Eden, but that art and storytelling are playing with shadows. There is a joy and a production of self, a usable history and memory and drawing that historiography, a type of academic history, cannot offer. So now, quote, if you hear the voice of God, that's where the garden was, end quote. So shadows make theophany possible today. Shadows and ink filling in the page and in some ways making it blank, a process she extrapolates from yet another story of Denison's, which I'll discuss, and connect it to even Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, offer Finck's biblical interpretation and literary response to Finck's visions of history, from John Calvin's ideas about predetermination and Paradise Lost to Jewish historiography. She responds, she offers something that I think that we can use even in response to Yerushalmi's classic Zachor. Making the page blank in the book is a ritualization of something like repentance. So okay, let me stay here for a minute. So shaping the construction of self as a frustration of old versions that fell short for whatever reason. So I argue that the text is a type of mood memoir, that basically Finck is naming herself as neurodiverse, both for having autism and clinical anxiety. But that by making the page blank, then this new kind of process that she goes through in the text, she's experimenting with how to make her own narrative. And she's also even blanking out some of the other ways that people have talked about her, which I think is really important too. And I think this is a type of response to historiography in a way, that in his now classic text, Zachor, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi pinpoints a reason why historiography is dissatisfying as an ending point for the construction of a usable past. The hypertrophy or bloat that has resulted from extensive work in Jewish studies to argue for the suitability for Jews as citizens. Not that I take this to be the only task of Jewish studies, but I think it's a key goal for many, may feel like the burden of perseveration or anxiety. What are Jews to do with all this historiography? It can be paralyzing. So making the page blank is not so much forgetting historiography as finding creative ways to satisfactorily integrate historiography. Art, Finck suggests, offers the meta-history that Yerushalmi sought, reconciling past and present. One needs a shadow, the usable past, some ink, but not so much that the page is just blacked out. So throughout the memoir, Finck makes both overt and implicit references or allusions to the memoirs and body of fiction of Isaac Dinesen or Karen Blixen, who I've already mentioned here. Blixen's Out of Africa is maybe the most well-known adaptation of her work. But with Susan Hardy-Aiken, I argue that the writing of Blixen shows a more nuanced understanding of her location within both patriarchy and colonialism. Blixen presents the relationship between Europe and Africa, like that between men and women, to be a continual transformational slippage. The slippage is destabilizing for any narrative. No final history can be told. This means Blixen also calls into question the European phallocentric notion of the single sovereign territorializing self, at the same time that she unsettles the representational systems that uphold the imperialist project and destabilizes the language of property, propriety, and power on which it rests. Blixen articulates in two of her tales, The Dreamers, which I opened with, and The Blank Page, concepts that help unlock the task that Finck illustrates in Passing for Human as a possibility in storytelling that may show how we can help reflect on Finck as a response to the quandary in Zachor. Fusing Blixen's theory with the classic exegetical practice of Jewish midrash, Leola asserts the most important part of a story is the blank space. You look at it and you see what you want to see. Most storytellers don't know this. They're dazzled by words. This assertion speaks to the importance of how to interpret visually, especially Finck's own sparse drawing style. And it even makes an argument for telling a story visually and not only verbally. Not only does Finck verbally assert the significance of a blank space, but then she also blacks out, which I think are really important. She blacks out pages between 5 chapter ones. Okay, so the text doesn't have like different numbered chapters. They're all chapter 1, which I'll discuss further. But I want to talk about the blacked out pages first. The blacked out page, or what I'm calling the page made blank, symbolizes a number of things. Leola and or Liana Finck is frustrated with each narrative starting place for the book. Rather than causing this to derail the narrative, she destabilizes the need to choose a starting point Again, turning a potential difficulty into a narrative and form strength of the text. The ink represents the hypertrophy of all historiographical narrative. There are so many details, it's difficult to include them all, and she doesn't want any one of these points to somehow over-determine who she is. She wants to see herself as an individual connected to these different things, but she doesn't want each of them to matter too much. So to tell a good story, to create a usable history, she must kind of add a blank space to tamper with facts. She kind of argues about this too, which is less about dishonesty and more about meaning. I would argue that to become overwhelmed and begin again is not a failure, but an essential part of the creative process. It's a crucial part of the human process. I think that the page made blank is we can see other places in Jewish tradition. It's like a new king anointed in oil, a woman who slips beneath the waters of a mikveh, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur before the dawning of white for Simchat Torah. Yerushalmi claims that his purpose in Zachor was to make a sharp distinction between collective memory and historiography, and certainly, as I say, to underscore the hypertrophy of the latter. He argues that Jews today are in search of a past, but they patently do not want the past that is offered by historians. They don't reject history out of hand, but seem to await a new meta-historical myth. So he also really is concerned with what is the relationship between history and the crisis of Jewish emancipation, the struggle to attain it. This view of the contemporary, in which history as a mode is dissatisfying for producing Jewish community and sense of self, really undergirds how he returns to antiquity and the medieval period. But I would argue that Denison and Finck ultimately seek a history not determined by past histories, a self not determined by past selves. Finck draws herself, but in a way that is wary of a self represented in any authoritative fashion. So it kind of parallels, but then departs from Yerushalmi in important ways. It turns to Jewishness in a more intersectional and I think dynamic way. So there are kind of two ways to look at Yerushalmi's conclusion to Zachor. That one is to say he seems to throw up his hands in frustration with what he narrated, that there are some details that he just thinks are kind of weird about the Jewish relationship to history, and he doesn't know what to do. And another is that he worries that engaging Jewish historiography has been a trap. But I would say that instead, that what Finck suggests is that there's no such thing as the Jewish relationship to history, but only Jewish relationships to history, deeply informed by the many contexts and experiences of individuals and groups. And that second, destabilization and fragmentation are actually things of value because of the possibilities they create for the construction of self via storytelling, because of the continuous need to make and remake the tale. They're not only untold blank pages, but through ritual and liturgy, Jews can and do make the page blank. One cannot lose oneself, in other words, no matter how hard or lonely life can become. Even if one has suffered like Job, one can find a friendship or love like that of Ruth and Boaz. And that's how she actually, and ultimately, beyond kind of the details of what I want to talk about, she illustrates her parents' relationship through Ruth and Boaz, and says, like, one reinvents oneself however one sees fit. And that this is a matter of vision that seems acutely relevant. If you really know how to look at things, Finck writes, you'll see that every man is the first man and every place is Eden. Finck comments on the nature of memory and history, memoir and fiction, through her own deft use of narrative and meta-narrative throughout the graphic text and paratext. So paratext being the stuff that's around, the before and after the story. And Finck explicitly calls Passing for Human a graphic memoir in the book's title, yet names herself Leola in the story, reminding readers that any story is a matter of narrative invention. Putting pen to paper to tell a story, she must make choices about how to tell and draw her memoir. A memoir is a selective retelling of the past, right? So she's really explicit that even if it's a story about herself, she has mediated it. Right? And I think that's what's really strong about graphic memoirs, this kind of deliberate mediation. And I think it's an interesting alternative to other forms of visual culture, especially photographs that can work hard to naturalize themselves and to appear unmediated, that the ways that graphic novels work hard to show their presentation of narrative as mediated, that they work hard to show, even when they're memoirs, the layers of how they have been put together. I think it's really important. And then that graphic artists tend to work hard to show how other forms of visual culture have been mediated, even if people might tend to make a mistake about those. And I think that's important related to all kinds of ways that Jewish history has been named from the outside, whether it's archival data about immigration, whether it's even in particular related to I can't help but think about courses that fill here in the US about Jewish life, in particular courses about the Shoah tend to be the courses that fill, both for Jews and non-Jews. And then even there, the types of visual culture that we tend to look at are photographs, and the way that these are all things that actually tend to be visual culture produced by non-Jews about Jews that stand in for Jews telling their own stories. And here in graphic novels, we have a way that Jews can produce both Jewish thought and then on very individual levels, reclaim their own stories. And this, I think, is really important for what I'm going to talk about with Hannah Arendt and the people in this graphic novel about her by Ken Kremstein, as well as the text about Anne Frank that I'll talk about in a moment. All right, I want to make sure that I stay careful about time, but I'll just say quickly that there are these many different starting points or geneses, that between the prologue and epilogue, there are 5 chapter ones that help her think about all the different places that her story might start, that she thinks about, in particular, right, she's trying to determine the Jewishness that she sees as coming from her mother in particular, and the Jewish women and her transatlantic East European ancestry, and then her concerns about her father, where it's less a question about having a shadow and more about this concern about what is it to be neurodiverse and the other ways she's afraid that she's not seen as a reliable narrator of her own story. And so here we see one of the in-between stories. She basically visualizes anxiety, and where I talked before about Anu Linich and that page where she has a number of different selves. Anu Linich has a kind of small version of her soul with whom she speaks. Here, Liana Finck illustrates not like an externalization of self that's like a little self. Instead, she just has like this externalization of anxiety that is rats chewing on her body and talking to her. Right? And so saying to her, what were you thinking, trying to put your dad in a story? She's telling her, I thought I was doing what you told me to do, you know. But what's really important here, right, is that she's saying, even, you know, she said, they say stupid, we're only good at telling you what not to do. your dad isn't hiding some secret weirdness, you know, like they're criticizing the way she has chosen to narrate her own story, right? The anxiety is this internalized voice about not being a reliable narrator, even of her own life, not being allowed to tell the story even the way she understands it, or to draw it as she understands it. And she says, look, maybe he isn't, but I am. And it's helpful for me to have a lineage for my weirdness, even if it's imaginary, right? So this way that she's talking about graphic novels as a useful way of narrating one's own story, whether she's narrating it through visions of her mother's family, visions of her father's family, or just visualizing her anxiety, right? This type of meta narrative about what it is to tell one's own story, that she has these really different ways of drawing out what the self is and where it came from, the fragmentation, and how hard it is just to put a narrative together, what stops one from doing it, why the self is fragmented, and then how she can ultimately put it back together, put something together. Okay. So let me really shift gears. In an adapter's note to the back of the graphic adaptation of Anne Frank's diary, Ari Folman explains, we made no attempt to guess in what manner Anne might have drawn her diary if she had been an artist instead of a writer. So here we have like a really different type of authorship, that where Liana Finck draws her own graphic novel. I'm really fascinated with this one. In my larger project, I'm thinking about Black and Jewish graphic novels right now as responses to white supremacy in the United States. And so another text that I think is really fascinating with this one is a graphic adaptation of the autobiography of Malcolm X, I'll say. And I think what's important here is seeing that we don't have a visualization of what this author or of what Anne Frank would have drawn, right? And that they, again, even in a way that's similar to Finck, they lay bare that this is a mediated story. There's so many ways that actually using animals helps lay bare that it's a mediated story. This is not how most of the text goes through, but I think this particular scene is interesting because it reveals a kind of intertextuality with mouse, with Art Spiegelman's mouse, even though this image doesn't reveal them all as the same type of animal. It gives the families very different types of animals, although we can see that with Otto and Margaret and that they're, or Anna, that they are all birds, that this type of animal visualization helps us think about, in particular, their hunger, right? That in this incarceration in the annex that we see, they are behind bars here, right? That it makes more literal what we should understand the text to be illustrating, an incarceration. That the text is mediated. And I think this is also a really important response to an iconography or legacy of how the Diary of Anne Frank has been presented, right? If it's so often contextualized internationally, and especially in the United States, as related to liberalism, this so often with this quote that gets decontextualized to say that people are really good at heart, that with others, with Tim Cole in particular, I would argue that it's an unsuitable concluding frame for her life, that it decouples Anne from Bergen-Belsen, and even from the text quote in the diary. The next line in the diary says, I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. In Finck's own words, the goodness she wished to see in people was being corroded by the suffering that she feared, that she was experiencing, and other suffering that she knew awaited for her, that she is thinking about what's going on outside of the annex at the same time that she's experiencing hunger. Even as she's experiencing hunger, she's also revolted by food, thinking about what's going on in the world. And so I would argue that this graphic adaptation of the diary recontextualizes Anne as an incarcerated person, alienated from the world, in many ways alienated from her family. And that's part of what a diary can do, anchor her in this moment of alienation. And instead, the graphic adaptation allows us to sort of visually inhabit Finck's emotional experiences in her mind, often simultaneously experiencing several of her thoughts as thoughts and feelings as our eyes jump between pages. So here I have a few of her kind of fantasies of herself, and also thinking through in more complex ways than how the diary was at least originally translated into English, thinking about Dutchness culturally, if not nationally, kind of joining in this parade, celebrating the kind of Taylor Swift of her day, Princess Juliana having a new baby. She's suffering her flatmates in the top, where, you know, the one thing that's keeping her going is thinking about the princess, while her flatmates don't want to hear about it. But we see her kind of visual fantasies where really she injects herself into them, right? We see in that middle panel that she's sitting there with the princess. She's actually holding the baby. And then in the bottom panel, of course, it is later that night, but we can see how even as she's holding herself together through these types of positive fantasies, that she's almost always plagued by fear and anxiety and worry and concern for what else could happen, right? That at night the bad thoughts creep into her mind. How difficult it must have been to sleep worrying about all of these things, as that kind of violent anxiety rips apart her consciousness, her well-being, tearing apart her own sense of security and her precarious position. I think what's important about what they do is also to insert some of what initially gets cut out in the earlier publications of the diary and illustrations of that, right? So her fights with her mother, her difficult relationship with her mother. And I think this is important not only for giving a kind of fuller depiction in a way of what's in the diary and of her emotional life, allowing to just kind of, in a sense, be her own self, but it also says something about what political innocence is. That so what if a child hates their mother for a moment, right? Like, that's something that we all are allowed to do. And it doesn't make her somehow less innocent as a political victim to have been going through that. I mean, to imagine living within such a small incarcerated space. And I think the way that they do this says something really interesting about what happens visually with verbal text, especially thinking about the way that even that the graphic novel gets translated, or thinking about communities of response, readerships, that so many of the people who would read this text in translation, Jewish or non-Jewish, might not be able to recognize the Hebrew here. For example, the Hebrew is a signifier in English of her Jewishness. It's not necessarily just a linguistic communication in the way that I think for Hebrew readers, if this were the Hebrew version of this graphic novel, the prayer would function differently. It would mean some different things, but the way they visualize it, it works differently, or not the Hebrew, but Aramaic, right? But that you can read it if you're a Hebrew reader, and that it also is simply a signifier of her Jewishness in the way that they would even bury her mother, right? So it kind of restores a type of Jewishness to the Franks that in the presentation of Anne Frank's iconography, so often, whether it's the play or the film or so many of the other ways that Anne Frank gets presented, that so often she's almost stripped of her Jewishness, the very thing for which she's persecuted. And so with just some small, I think, gestures in the graphic novel, they put together a much more complex version of her. But even as they do that, you know, they leave Anne in the way that she thinks about herself, both as Jewish, but as really highly cosmopolitan. So these images from Munch's The Scream, from The Woman in Gold, which of course also there's a whole feature film about Gustav Klemt's The Woman in Gold, that these again project herself into these images that, unlike her sister who wanted to go to the land of Israel, what was then Palestine, that Anne really didn't think that that's what she wanted to do. She thought that she wanted to stay in Western Europe. And so in the way that they illustrate her, they let her kind of remain or even become the version of herself over and over in ways that she wanted to be. But I think that the choice of these two images is really interesting as a response to the Shoah, because each of these images was stolen. The Scream was stolen twice from art museums. And I think in making the selection to project Anne's self into these two images, that they actually visually invoke an argument about restoration of Jewish property. Like, why is it that these two visual texts receive such kind of international attention, sting operations, concern for restoring artwork, even rewards, while it takes decades for the rightful Jewish owners of artwork to ever even be able to get their materials back after the Shoah, right? Whose art matters, whose ownership matters, what theft matters. The graphic novel, you know, in some ways, and even they make claims that it's intended for children, but it's really a very dense graphic novel that I think layers together a lot of questions that come up about, for example, reparations or other really difficult issues related to the Shoah, related to suffering, that are not necessarily just about Anne, but that weave together really important questions about art and visual culture. Okay, I want to just finish quickly. Oh, and also, I wanted to say too that this image I opened in the meet, right? One last really important image that, of course, the other sections that are edited out in the original publication by her father are sections about her thinking about her own body and thinking about her sexuality. And this way, with the graphic adaptation, they do illustrate and include extensive writing where she's allowed to talk about her own body, as well as to talk about how fulfilling and important it is to her that she was never able to do that. She's alienated from her whole family for the fact that she can't talk about those things. And so she's able to put that into the text. Lastly, I'll just say something really short about the Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt, I think, and then open it up for questions. That the text is really fascinating. It's very dense. Again, it works. You know, each, I think, graphic novelist has their own style. And something that's so important here is the idea of experimentation. That what Kremstein does is put together a visualization of Hannah Arendt's friendships, in particular with Walter Benjamin, and those friendships then appear as a type of alternative to a number of important things. They're an alternative to the abuse of power in Heidegger's relationship with Arendt. They're a kind of alternative in general, even to her marriages and sexual relationship in general. But then for Arendt, and Andrea Cooper has done a great job in gendering modern Jewish thought and speaking a lot about this, but Arendt really had a theory that friendship is an alternative to brotherhood for creating a way of thinking about relationship in public. That brotherhood tries too much to dissolve everything, to create kind of only one type of truth, and that brotherhood itself is basically a Christian category. So Arendt is interested in friendship. So by drawing the Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt through friendship, it embodies this idea of Arendt's own thought, her own political theory. It uses that friendship to counter Heidegger in a number of ways, from his anti-Semitism to his misogyny, and then it also, I think what's interesting about the text is that by making it a narrative, thinking about beginnings and ends, this also embodies and contextualizes Arendt's thought and life by making an individual life important, and doing a type of storytelling that I think gets into Denison again, how Arendt herself drew on Denison in her thought. And then because Benjamin is so important in Arendt's relationships, and her friendship with Benjamin is the friendship that offers the alternative, for one thing. It is the egalitarian, we can say, friendship, opposed to the hierarchical relationship that she has with Heidegger. And aside from that, I think that what Kremstein's graphic novel does is present a text that does something very similar to what Benjamin himself wanted the Arcades Project to do, and even what Benjamin thought he was drawing from Charles Baudelaire before him. That I have actually been just this image from Convolute M from the Arcades Project, where even he's talking about Baudelaire. Because what I want to say is, like, the visuality of how Benjamin put together the Arcades Project is as important as the particular content. That Benjamin wanted to create a type of Jewish thought not just Jewish thought, but thought and political theory for urban people, for contemporary people, and he was experimenting. But that the way the Arcades Project works is that if one is on a train moving quickly in an urban world, where one doesn't really have time to read all, one can sit and grab just one little fragment here, right? That Benjamin's visual presentation of his thought also thinks about fragmentation. in a way that graphic novels visualize fragmentation. And that I think Benjamin's thought suggests that the experience of modernity, beginning with World War I, like thinking about, as opposed to Freud, who really says that the fragmentation of the self is a type of neurosis, which would suggest that there's something wrong with you, that it's temporary, that it can be treated and go away. Then instead what Benjamin says is, no, this is something like imposed on us. It's something technological, and it's almost like here to stay in the very shift of how modern society has been put together, and that we're all so bombarded and alienated. And so in the Arcades project, Benjamin tries to put something together to meet people where they are. And he draws on Baudelaire too. He sees Baudelaire as like the last lyrical poet. He sees him as the last because he means he's the last one who could sell any books. He's not the last person trying to write lyrical poetry, but he sells books because he writes lyrical poetry for urban people. And so Benjamin writes a type of thought for urban people that's consumable to a lot of, he hopes, for a lot of different people. And then he also has these other types of markings that work almost like hyperlinks beyond what I'll go into. And I think that what Kremsin is trying to do in the way that he presents the graphic novel is to take up a form that is for contemporary people. For visual people, this is just kind of, visuality is the form of the day. And that if Kremsin wants to do thought, if he wants to do Jewish thought, if he wants to talk about all of these kind of people who are so important, who are Arendt's friends, who are Benjamin's friends, if he wants to convince really a lot of people to think about Jewish thought, he's arguing, right, actually, like the place to do it is not an academic department. The place to do it is in art and in graphic novels, and especially in trying to recover these blank spaces, in imagining their friendships and their connections, as much as thinking about what is the content of their Jewish thought. It's also about creating these relationships. And I'll just kind of conclude by looking at this place here in the bottom left, where he says, where time has become space, and thanks in no small measure to Heidegger, where being itself is blown to bits, and where I soak it all in from my usual seat at the best table, right? So he's narrating in this way, thinking about Arendt's life, but he's really talking about, I think, on the one hand, Benjamin's concern with modernity, the fragmentation of the self, of the world, of the way that we're bombarded and shocked all the time into not really being able to take anything in. And then saying that there's something about visuality that actually allows us to find ourselves again and to create connections through drawing a narrative, through drawing relationships, imagining what good relationships are. That Benjamin says these kinds of shocks make it possible that we don't know who our enemies are and who our friends are. And that I think each of these graphic novels takes up a way of thinking about who are ourselves and who are our friends, how do individuals relate to a collective without being subsumed by any collective narrative. That we can't really start at the top. We have to start any storytelling at the bottom, and that reconstructing individuals' lives is important, and it is essential, that that's where memory happens, and that we have to do that as a kind of exegetical way to approaching the truth of the past. And that it has to be gendered and contextualized. I think that's what all three of these graphic texts share in thinking about what a usable past can be. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. That was great. a lot to take in, and I'll hold off a minute to ask my own question or make my own comment. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Sorry, it takes a minute, so I just I'm ready to go, but I don't want to take advantage of my speaker's role. Okay, so then while everyone's thinking up, okay, so what's so interesting to me is that the way we have talked about graphic novels, like in the, I guess post Mouse, but I would even say really the last decade, is so much linked with memory and memory studies. And I love your Dennison quote that what history doesn't put in ink, memory records in the blank spaces. And so I've had the opportunity to read a few books that really utilize that historiography versus memory in the graphic novels, and it's so different than reading books about graphic novels from like the 70s and 80s that looked at graphic novels completely through the sociological lens. It was like how gender was painted, how ethnicity was painted, drawn, relationships, scapegoating. And so it's such a different focus. And then, of course, the graphic novelists, the graphic artists, really have, experimented with this. So it forces us to kind of look at all the spaces, right? And it's forced us to think about sequential narrative through this kind of like, real concrete focus on between the different frames. So I was wondering if you had an opinion about kind of what came first, the horse or the cart, not or the cart, the whatever the other idiom is, what came first? Like do you think that the shift from comic books to graphic novels is partially because of the critical appraisal of sequential narrative and like the focus on the medium?
That's I think that's a really great question. I think that right, that as you say, this kind of post-Mouse question about memory, I think is a really interesting way to frame it. I think that when Spiegelman was writing Mouse, even the way that he writes the second volume of Mouse, he integrates himself so much of a response to critics, right, in that text. So I would say that the place of meta-narrative in what he does in Mouse already integrates it, but then the types of questions that he gets and is able to respond to in the second volume, I think it's really great and fascinating that he does that. I think it's an interesting development. It reminds me of even well, I don't want to follow that thought, but I'll just say like the fact that it's like watching him not just write a meta-narrative about a relationship with his father, but he's writing a meta-narrative about then his relationship with his critics in the graphic novel, right? That anything is really up for discussion in the form itself is, I think, something unique in a way from other literature in particular. I would say I can't it's interesting to imagine if that's as true. I don't think that's as true of visual art. I think that response to critics is more commonly maybe visualized, if more subtly, in visual art. But I think what you say about experimentation is really important here too. That I think part of the form in thinking about experimentation itself, actually part of what Krimstein does, I didn't talk about. I had a page where he really explicitly talks about Hannah Arendt and John Coltrane, and the relationship between jazz and political theory. And I think the relationship between jazz and graphic novels is really important for thinking about the relationship between experimentation itself. It is such an experimental art form, right? That it's just so open to being dynamic, to open to experimenting with new questions, and open to not, in other words, I think having an orthodoxy as well, that it's all the only right thing is experimentation, right? That other than that, and in that way too, there are a lot of different things that can be synthesized together. And so I think Coltrane is so important for thinking about what's happening in Arendt's own lifetime, but also the kind of meta place that jazz has for urban art forms in the US, for transatlantic art forms between Africa and West Asia and the US, and for thinking about what Krimstein is really saying that he's doing, that he's experimenting here, right? Experimenting not only in visual art and graphic culture, but in experimenting in Jewish thought, right? That it's an innovative form, again, in Jewish thought, right? The kind of angle that I'm trying to take of saying, like, where do you find Jewish thought? That it's not just in a kind of small conference room at an annual right thing, but that it's here, and that this may be the more interesting way to do it, because it does kind of decanonize it at the same time that we see a lot of people, and it makes it multivocal in important ways, but it loosens it up, and asks new questions in a number of ways. And that I think then what makes that different maybe from, I guess, what I was thinking at some of what you asked about memory is just that it's not only about family memory. I think some of what even those types of questions, or thinking about Coltrane in particular, or thinking about what I've been trying to do, thinking about Black forms to it, is that it's, again, a response to white supremacy and the way that Jewish life and Jewish thought has been pigeonholed.
Yeah, so I didn't mean personal memory either. Exactly your train of thought with like historical collective memory and historiography, the accepted, established, you're going to call.
How far back do we have to go to get out of the frustration?
It just seems though that like the evidence is piling up only because the artists are looking at the media theorists, right? The Frankfurt School, Arendt, like they're looking at all the people who like even defined how we think of media this way. So it's really interesting.
You're right. That they're going back to them at the same time that they're also offering, I think, a larger critique of them.
Yeah, it's great.
It's great.
Okay, so does anyone else want to jump in so I don't end up taking up all of Jessica's time with my questions?
Jessica, I would like to share with you my maybe perception or feelings when I see graphic novels or comics about history and about traumatic history. It's just a personal experience. So I'm feeling uneasy with the very clear, very purified artistic language versus the real historic experiences. And I just wonder if young generation sees the traumatic memories as a kind of comics, so the borders between the real traumatic experiences and fairy tales are going to be blurred, and the real tragedy, the real traumatic experience that is not presented in front of somebody's eyes, but through the media, maybe or is perceived as a kind of another comics. So it's not real. Even it's not real because I have an experience of this kind of literature to see the tragedy as something sublimated, something not really not real, not really happened maybe.
Yeah.
Because of once again the narrative in these images is really very serious and really tragic, but the artistic expression, the very graphic language is very calm.
It's interesting because of, especially in English, the way the play on, right, the idea that graphic language is calm, even the way you presented it, so such a paradox. I hear you. I think that's a fear, but I think that, you know, in the chapter that I write, part of what I really go through with this or with other examples is the consideration of how much, so for example, with this, with the Shoah in particular, the way that its presentation in the US in, let's say, young adult literature in particular, the question of whether it's already been sanitized and whether this might be less sanitizing, I guess that would be the way to think about it, right? And I think it's a real concern that the question of what is the place of the Diary of Anne Frank in American memory, both historically when it's originally translated and then in its reception, right? So part of what I want to say is that in its let's say original translation, in its publication in English, so much of the diary is edited out. And so much of how it's often taught emphasizes things like all people being good at heart, right? So there's a type of frame for it that actually, I would argue, already suggests something that's not true. If that presents it as if we don't really need to do some kind of difficult work when we think about a trauma like the Shoah. And it often, a lot of, beyond the diary, a lot of young adult literature in the United States, in particular, the context that I'm thinking about, tends to present the Shoah, and the Shoah has become a model that any kind of violence, there's generally an approach of offering so-called young adult literature where the goal is kind of to have readers or viewers identify with the victim. But this is really a problem because I I think one of our goals should be to ask, like, how are we like the perpetrators, right? That it's really a problem if everyone's always identifying with victims. It's not that there aren't people in the US who have identities that are deeply tied to the Finck family, for example, or other really horrific traumas. But we do know, like, a lot of Rachel Dean Ruzicka has a really great text thinking about young adult literature and going through and arguing just how, on the one hand, widely read the diary is, but how often it's really basically read as just a cool book about a teenager, right? That the kind of method is people just read it as a coming of age story. And so what I really want to say, and I understand what you're saying, at least initially, but I would say that the closer one looks at the graphic adaptation, the more that the graphic adaptation actually recontextualizes her experience and Finck's experiences in incarceration in the annex, and really also avoids at the same time a type of language that because so often the diary is or has been the only literature that people in the United States, especially in public education, have read about the Shoah, that there's a type of critique of it that it's not even it's not even the Shoah, and that it's not even where the Shoah happens. And I think that part of what I find compelling about thinking about the graphic novel itself is thinking about the way that they visualize suffering, that they visualize hunger, that they visualize the experiences of anxiety in particular, the difficulty of what this family is going through in incarceration, as well as their contextualization within the Nazi regime, right? And knowing what's going on outside and the many ways that they visualize deportations of trains or what's going on in camp, right? That they are listening to the radio, that they do have all these kinds of connections to what's happening outside. So again, what I'm arguing about the way that it's a deliberate presentation of mediation, in part what I'm saying is that there's no presentation of the past that's unmediated, right? That there isn't anything that we can offer children or adults that is an unmediated presentation of the past. And so if part of what we do is teach young learners, university learners, that texts give us a version of the past and that our task is to figure out what happened in history, I think, for example, reading the graphic novel with Anne Frank's own words, which are there in the book, right? They keep her words in many places. I think if it were paired with other things, that'd be one thing. But it's also, I think, an important example compared to a proliferation of, what in the US is like Holocaust literature, that is very often by non-Jews who do no research, who write it for non-Jews, and it sells very, very well, right? So I think, like what you're talking about, a concern of presenting a story and the idea that it didn't happen. Actually, I think there's so much literature right now in the US that truly erases Jews from the story. I mean, the Boy in the Striped Pajamas, the Book Thief, these are all stories that they have literally one, each of those, for example, has one Jew in them. Those are the stories that people in the US tend to have read even when they come to college. And So there is a real issue that even when people have received education about the Shoah, they haven't learned about it. So there's something happening with the graphic adaptation that is rooted in historical documents, that reconstructs the past and also teaches people about, I think, how to understand the past in a sophisticated way that I think is really important. I don't think it should be the only text anyone accesses, but I think it does something really, really important and restores a thinking about texts that offer us something from people who actually experienced the past in ways that other examples from what's proliferating here really erase Jews even from the Shoah.
Thank you very much. Really illuminating explanation, and really I meant not only the Holocaust, but
Right.
yes, any violence, and think it's really helpful.
Sure.
I just want to mention because Daria Van Frank was I don't know, like mostly for American readers, that it was produced and directed, right, by Ari Folman and David Polanski, who did Waltz with Bashir.
Sure.
And that was kind of the film that everyone in Israel knows as bringing the idea of violence and PTSD to right to the Israeli soldiers, and they worked on that one also. So I think there is a conceptual overlap, even though, you know, aesthetically it doesn't look that way.
Right. And Ari Folman has now actually worked on a new production. I didn't talk about it here, but there's a new film and graphic novel he did with a different illustrator besides Polanski, but I can't remember her name, but it's called Efo Anna Frank, Where is Anne Frank? That is actually Kitty, the diary comes to life, and it's about her, and it's an engagement with fascism and like what's going on, and then a kind of time travel around the world, and Kitty as a non-Jew, actually, talking, right, that she asks, and why is she not Jewish, and what does it mean to be a Jew? And then I think still more talking about this, that Folman himself is so interested in memory, right? He's done, and also in psychology, that he's done a lot of work with HBO and that kind of, I mean, that's really his area, right? Again, to kind of connect these two questions. But that he, and about Waltz with Bashir, I mean, he has really firmly said Waltz with Bashir is a documentary, right? I mean, Ilya, like, to go to that question, that he's saying, like, this is no less a documentary than one built with photography, because we have to understand the ways that photographs are mediated constructions. Who's doing them? How do they objectify people? How do they subjectify people, right? That there are no unmediated access to anyone, and that they're really, and so I think he in particular actually I had a conversation once when he was at Indiana during my graduate degree, and I think actually he really informed my way of thinking about how these are documents of the past, and that these types of reconstructions, in particular, where there's something missing from the record, right? That Waltz with Bashir reconstructs something missing from the record, and something that might at first seem to be undesirable, but then becomes a really meaningful narrative, right? That there are these types of traumas that need to be worked out in order to put oneself back together, right? Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a really important question.
But Jessica, right there, you said something great, that they are documents of the past. They're not documents of the historiography that has been accepted. They're documents of memory.
Right.
So that ties perfectly with what you said earlier. Yeah. Okay. We're just about at the end. If anyone has one more question, we could maybe take a short one. Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Jessica. And yeah. and a lot to think about. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's like already envisioning how this war is going to end up being recorded in graphic novels, and how the violence that Ilya is talking about, like how especially like such gruesome violence that people don't even want to post the images, how they're going to end up doing it in graphic novels. I don't know, that's kind of like what I was thinking
I think
about.
the disputes over what we can know, and the ways that images are posted quickly on social media, and then the disputes over whether or not we can trust them is already an important question, actually, especially with this war, and that there's something happening here between, like, again, can you trust what you see? And how do you know that you can trust it, right? How do we know what we know? I think there's a really important epistemological question.
I would love to see Liana Finck take this subject up.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
all right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.